It's good to see you all this evening. I thought it might be a little bit more of a homier crowd tonight, so I wanted to talk with you all about a few things that hopefully you can use that will help you with some of your children, your nieces, nephews, grandchildren, stuff like that. Things that I believe in observing these children, looking at them, what we can try to pass on to them. The Bible says in the greatest passage that the Old Testament Jews knew, containing the greatest commandment of all that Jesus said was the greatest, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema, where he said, the Lord your God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. And Jesus said the second commandment is like unto it, to love your neighbors yourself. In that basic greatest commandment, it says right after that, you shall teach them diligently unto your children. You shall write them upon your doorposts and all that kind of stuff, talking about the ways of God. So how do you get the children to be instructed in the ways of God? All right. There are different practical suggestions along that line you can give people. A lot of them are just natural. For example, you let children get comfortable with the idea that church is a place that they can be comfortable at. There are a lot of people that even to this day have the idea that you've got in a church building some sort of sanctimonious atmosphere, and children are like, oh no, I'm going to do something wrong in here. I got a bit of a problem with that. Back when I was an assistant scoutmaster, sometimes we would meet because different churches or whoever might be our sponsor. In other words, they would let us use their building, to meet in their facilities. And they knew I was a preacher, so some of the other scoutmasters would try to get me to explain to the children why they should behave better in the church. And I had a problem with them trying to get me to preach to the kids that way, because I was like, well, I don't see why they should mind me any more in the church building than they should, anywhere else. I just don't get the difference here. But they had this idea of, this, like I said, this sanctimonious place, and I think it gives the children a bad impression. You need to make a child comfortable with the idea, and there are many other practical suggestions like that, with the concept of religion and of the church. It should be part and parcel to their attitude and their being, not something they get all worked up about. For example, if a child gets into the idea that religion is something that is particular to a place, or they get in the idea that religion is something where God is only interacting with them in certain ways and times, then you will get them hesitant about prayer. Because if prayer is something that you just do as a special appeal, unto the Lord, as opposed to something that you're open to do at any time with God, and it doesn't have to be in a designated worship time or service, it's something that the Lord is open to the cries of his children, the appeals that they make to him, then they're going to get to where they're reserved and they feel as if they cannot do that at any time. And it's going to bother them, the idea of going to God in prayer, and they're going to lose the words even in their heart. If it's not even an audible prayer, they'll have a hard time expressing themselves because they get themselves worked up. They get all nervous about it. The other day, I was praising my dad, so I'm going to be able to criticize him outside of my presence here, and I don't feel bad about either one, so I'm going to balance it out a little bit. But my dad could have kind of a rough side to him because he was busy. He was trying to get stuff done. And he didn't necessarily explain to me what was going on. So when he would give me something to do, sometimes I would kind of freeze up. It's not because I didn't want to do what I was told. It's because I was unsure about what I was told. And I felt embarrassed to go back to him and admit ignorance as to what I should do. What is this thing? What tool is this? Where does it go? How do I put that up? Which building is the barn? Which one's the shed? What's the terms you're using here? I didn't know what he was necessarily talking about when he said go blah, blah, blah for me. And so I would get nervous about that, because he was a busy man, and I knew that, and it's not the kind of a fellow that you want to interfere with, if y'all know what I mean. And so I had that, kind of a nervous workup with me. People are that way with God. Children are that way. Because if they feel as if they are restricted in how they can approach them, then it will pull them back on the communication. They won't know how to express themselves. So many practical things we can say about that. However, I would like for a lot of this sermon for us to branch off a little bit into the way you think about the coming generation and how they think, okay? Philippians chapter 4. Y'all might want to check that out if you have a Bible with you. Philippians chapter 4. It talks there about the different qualities or good things that people ought to think about. If there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. All right, let's focus on a couple of those there, and I'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. One of the things he said is, whatsoever things are true. All right, so you're looking at Philippians 4, verses 4 through 8, okay? You want to keep your thinking to be positive, and he says, here's what you think of. Whatsoever things are true. Well, I've thought about that in the past, and I worried some about it. Let me give you an example. I really enjoy reading the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. He's the author of The Lord of the Rings. If any of y'all have ever seen those, the movies based on his books and things like that. I've not talked to some of y'all here about it, so sometimes since I know a little bit more about his background, I'll switch over here to Alan. Did you ever read the series and stuff, Lord of the Rings and stuff? Yeah, because that's our mindset, right? We like that kind of thing. And Tolkien was a great author. Every bit of that's made up, isn't it? There's not a thing in there that's true. Well, he said think on true things, right? But I never did read Tolkien thinking I was doing anything wrong. You see what I'm saying? My folks never came over to me, and Dad never said, how dare you read that, fancy novel or whatever. I say, that's just not true. He didn't think of it that way. So what did Paul mean when he said, whatsoever things are true? Well, when you look at what he's saying, he must have meant the same thing he meant when he said, look at another example there. Whatsoever things are of good report. Y'all see that in the passage? Same thing with it. There are negative things that happen in life, right? Bad things. And you have to focus on them to an extent to know how to deal with them. What's my solution to this? How do I ask God to help me with this? It is not a good thing that Brother Crow is up there, and in such a bad health. But if I don't think about that, then I'm not going to be reminded to pray for him. Well, but it says think of things that are of good report. That's a bad report. That's something bad that happened to somebody. I know that, but you cannot, if somebody comes to me for counseling, I can't just say, oh, no, we're not going to talk about that. That's a bad thing. I have to deal with it. Tell me what you've done. Tell me how we can work with this. That's a bad report. Well, Paul's not talking about that. When he says you think of those things that are of good report, he means you keep a positive mindset, right? He means that the things you dwell on are things that are good. It doesn't mean you don't deal with the bad stuff. It means that you don't neglect to have a positive outlook. What is the positive outlook for your children? Sometimes we fuss so much in front of them that we get to where they think the world is going, where in a handbasket. And there's nothing anybody can do about it, and it's just an awful thing that you have to live in this world. That is a bad impression on children. This life is a wonderful challenge. This world is made by the Lord. And God said in Genesis chapter 1 that he looked over all the things that he had made, including man, and behold, it was very good, God said. There's nothing bad about the creation. There's nothing bad about God giving you life. And children can have a bad experience because of the impressions that adults place on them. A child is very impressionable as to whether or not to have a positive outlook. I can remember when I was younger. By the way, that's another thing too. If you all ever I don't care how old you are. I don't care if you're 70. I don't care if you're 7. If you forget how it was to think and to be when you were even younger, then you're missing out. Don't ever forget it. I don't know how people seem to forget what it was like to be younger. Think for a minute. I can remember as a boy talking to another boy, And that boy was down and out about something. It wasn't anything that big. It was just boys talking to each other and anything. And he got all frustrated and he was like, well, I didn't ask to be born. That's what he said. And that stuck with me because as I thought about what he was saying to me and what he was doing, then I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back on it, I realized he was frustrated. And that frustration was showing through. He was not being told either by adults or by his friends. Nobody was getting to him and letting him know, number one, this too shall pass. There's not anything that's you're coming across that you can't handle. Number two, nobody was kind of telling him life is good. It was like you messed up. You done did this. You done did that. No, there's more to that than that in life. You've got to have the way God dealt with Cain in mind. In Genesis, early on in Genesis chapter 3 and 4. The fall of man, Genesis chapter 3. You go into Genesis chapter 4 and everybody knows Cain ends up killing Abel, right? Before Cain killed Abel, what was God doing with him? God came to him and number one, he said, why is your countenance downfallen? Now that's King James language. Why are you looking so tore up and sad? What's wrong, Cain? And then Cain didn't seem to want to answer him. Did God just give up on him? No. God said, Cain, if you do well, will you not be accepted? I don't have any problem with your sacrifices, Cain, if you'll give them like I said to give them. Cain gave of the fruit of the ground. He was a worker of the ground. He's a farmer. Abel was a shepherd. And he gave of the firstlings of his flock. Was it because he gave the first fruits and Cain did not? Maybe. Was it because God wanted a blood sacrifice and Cain was giving, because it was after the fall, and Cain was giving mere plants? In that case, all he had to do was trade some plants for Abel from the flock, and then he could give his sacrifice, right? That would be easy. He said, if you do well, you'll be accepted, God said. You see how God's encouraging him? He's saying it's not all bad, Cain. Don't worry about this. Don't dwell on it. If you do what you're supposed to do, you'll find acceptance and everything will be all right. Why are you so tore up about it? Just let's calm down a little bit. But instead, Cain just let himself, build with the anger and build with the frustration. So you have to remind young people and children, because in a way they were like children, wouldn't they? It's the beginning of creation. You have to remind them there is a way you can go wrong here, but there's a way you can do right, and all of this can be forgotten and everything get back right and good and everything will be hunky-dory, okay? Remind them of that. Otherwise, they're going to get frustrated and, I never wanted to be in this situation anyway. I never asked to be born. Well, he's mad. He was all frustrated, and nobody was telling him anything to alleviate his frustrations, giving him a different path. So we need to make sure that we do that with youngins. Youngins should be encouraged to think about those things that are true. If that doesn't mean you are not allowed to read a fantasy novel. Do you call it fantasy? I guess you do, don't it? Tolkien genre, fantasy. All right. If that means you're allowed to read like fantasy novels, Nancy Drew mystery novels, I don't know, whatever you float your boat. When I was a boy, my sister would read those Nancy Drew books, and I knew, well, I'm a boy, I can't read no Nancy Drew book. I could have, but I didn't want to. And so I thought, well, what's the equivalent of Nancy Drew? It have to be Hardy Boys Mysteries, right? So I grabbed some Hardy Boys books, and I started to read on them. Most boring books I've ever read in my life. I couldn't stand them. I thought that's the awfulest stuff I ever read. And it's not because I didn't like to read. I was a reader. I couldn't read them. Awful. Never read Hardy Boys novels. But anyway, all right, that's a different point. I really didn't like them. And she would just read those one after another. Well, that didn't get it to though where her mind was up there in the clouds and she was making up or didn't know how to delineate between reality and make-believe. The problem when the Bible says whatsoever things are true is just like when it said whatsoever things are a good report. What does that mean? It means you got to keep a positive outlook. Whatsoever things are true means that you cannot neglect your responsibility by having your head in the clouds all the time, okay? You got to keep them grounded in what's reasonable, what's according to reason, what's logical. Children neglect logical thinking if you let them. Therefore, you have to remind them that this is the real world. This is how things operate here. There's a difference between fake stuff and real stuff. And they need to know the difference. When a child knows the difference, then later on in life, they can make appropriate decisions. When a child doesn't know the difference, you get a lot of what we see nowadays. Now, let me pursue that for just a moment with you. I don't mean to be so helter-skelter here. I'm talking about things I'm hoping will help you, in your pursuit of some of these things in talking to youngins, and you'll understand them a little bit more when they talk to you and respond to you. The biggest pushback I ever get from children in a school setting, and I sometimes deliberately push the button with them on this to see how they're going to react, is when I remind them of things that are, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. Here's what's possible and here's what's not possible. And they push back on that. And I know why. I've got a good idea of why they do that. They push back at yours truly because they have been given this spiel, this outlook their whole life, that the sky is the limit. You're going to be anything that you can dream of being. Don't restrict your dreams and all of this stuff. Are any of those statements wrong in and of themselves? Not a one of them. They're all fine. But everything from the valedictorian and school addresses I hear, both in high school and college, all the way down to different things our children are told in life, is getting them to where they don't deal with practically, what do I need to focus on? What do I need to do in order for me to be successful in life and in religion? I am good at blah, blah, blah. I need to focus on that. Y'all know as well as I do that there are some children, you can peg them right off the bat. He's going to be one of the best farmers you can ever get your hands a hold of. He's going to feed the world. Well, that man, he's got it all. There's something about him to where his mind is in tune with that, and that's all he's interested in. I don't know how many times I've seen society try to take a boy, and I'm not saying he don't need to read and write. He can read and write, that's fine. But once he's learned how to do that, you might as well turn him out there in that field. That man is going to result in beef prices going down all across the world. He's that good of a farmer, and that's all he's interested in. That's what he wants to be. He can get in touch with that, and he understands it. But then they're over at school trying to tell them, no, you might want to be president or a nuclear physicist one day. No, he's not. Okay? He's not. And he doesn't want to do that. Why don't you leave him alone? Why don't you let him be what he obviously is meant to be? Now, he wouldn't be offended at all if I told you all this. You go tell, he was a little boy when I was preaching at Mount Gilead, but Reese Lyons, if any of y'all know that family or anything, you go tell Reese Lyons that he needs to be a politician or a scientist or something. He might as well smack me if I was to say that. He's not interested in that. Reese is one of them. He told his mama he'd complete high school, but he'd walk into class. And I'd say, thankfully, he didn't do this at church. But he'd walk over in class, and he'd have these muddy boots on, tracking mud all over the place. And they'd have to make him go and sweep it up or something. Well, why? It was because he got up at 4 or 5 in the morning and went and fed first before he came to school. He knew what he was interested in. He knew what he was dealing with, and he knew he needed to take care of his cattle. He wasn't interested in any form or fashion with school. We'd sit him down there, and he was taking one of those form tests, that they take the achievement test kind of things. And now look, he wouldn't mind me telling y'all this. I just know Reese. This way, he's sitting there just like, C, you're the longest answer. Well, he's just marking down the little answers. He didn't care. He didn't care one bit. He didn't want to be there in school. He already knew how to read and write. Thankfully, I couldn't do this with him anymore. I remember one time we was over at church camp, and if he couldn't be around his dog, he missed his dog. And if he couldn't be over there taking care of the farm with his daddy, Reese wasn't interested in it. He was over at church camp with his mama one year. And so he got to sulking about it. And his mama had gone off to pick up something at the store or whatever. And I was directing that year. So I found Reese over back behind the the big main lodge. And so I come back there, and he's sitting there, and I miss old whatever, talking about his dog or whatever. He's just a boy at the time. And I couldn't get anywhere with him. I couldn't talk to him. It's time for the next activity, Reese. You get up from back here and go to it. And finally, I realized I'm talking to a boy that's not going to understand language any other way. I stood over him and I said, Reese, I'm bigger than you. I said, I'm going to grab a hold of you and I'm going to drag you to this. You're going to it. You understand me? Get up. He was like, and then there he went, He knew how the world worked. Now, I couldn't do that bit. If I was telling him that nowadays, he'd look over me and say, let's see who drags who. But anyway, I'm telling you, children need to be allowed to be grounded and to understand their limitations and to understand the difference between real and fake, or the possible and the impossible. It's okay for a child to know their limitations. You say, well, Tim, how does this manifest itself? Well, I gave y'all the recent example of this. We have sent that Artemis ship up to go around the moon, right? That's incredible. Did y'all see the picture? One of them they sent back from going around, they're fixing to head around the moon. I think today they were going to start the circumvent, weren't they? I think that starts today. I don't know if any of y'all keep track of this, but it's really, really neat stuff. They took a picture of the Earth from where they were at when they were about, 120, 150,000 miles out, and they took a picture of the Earth. It was so hard for me to wrap my brain around that picture until the caption under it explained in the story. They said, hey, when they took the picture relative to the Earth, they were upside down to the Earth. and finally, what I thought was a blob of Australia or something, it was like, oh no, that's Sahara, Africa, and that's why you got that big blue expanse and there's South America over there. Okay, now I get it. It was so hard to visualize it until I realized the possibilities of being in space. They're floating around out there and they take a picture of something and their spacecraft is probably like, woo, and everything. So they don't care what orientation they got, and they took a picture of the Earth. It was incredible looking. Y'all can look it up if you want to on the internet. They were going 220,000 miles, something like that. That's where the moon is. You got to go a couple 100,000 miles, and then they're going to go around it. They're not going to get on it. They're going to go around it and then come back to Earth. Hope them every bit of success. You worry about them a little bit because, they're way out there. If something bad went wrong, other than I heard the bathroom wasn't working, but other than that, if something bad went wrong, what would you do? But, and then they're coming back to Earth. Okay. That's a couple of 100,000 miles. You got people like that Elon Musk fella and some others, they said, hey, let's go to Mars. Now, he's given up on that. Why? Because that's like 200 million miles. You're not going to Mars. That's not happening, fella. Even the one of the richest men in all the world finally had to admit, we're not going to Mars. All right, let's just focus on moon stuff. Yeah, that's hard enough. And here you're wanting to go to Mars. You're not going to Mars, Elon. It ain't happening. And so his mind was not focused at the beginning on what was possible. You cannot do that. Well, they sent a probe. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and you could send a guy, I guess, and he'll be a dead guy. Okay? That's not what we're all about. You're not going to do that, okay? And he finally got you, all right, we're not going to do that. You talk to children like I have in school, and you try to explain to them about what you can do, whether it's in math class with numbers, what the limitations of language are, or what the limitations of space travel are, or things like that, the limitations of speed, the speed of light and stuff, and I can tell they're having a hard time. You mean you can't go faster than the speed of light? That's right. You can't do that. Nobody's going to Alpha Centauri. Well, you could if you had a blah, blah, blah. No, you can't. Young'un, you've been looking at too much Star Trek. You can't do that. That's not a physically possible thing. Physics disallows it. God made this world according to an organized nature, and you cannot do what you're talking about. It is impossible. Get your mind out of the clouds and get them in truth. When it comes to religion, your child will often be the same way. Get them focused on the difference between fake and on the truth. The truth is book, chapter, and verse. If you don't get it out of that Bible, you don't know it's true. Well, but I read in so-and-so that here's what happened in the past or whatever. If it's not in the Bible, you don't know it. You need multiple witnesses to establish truth, and men are liable to lie. You're gullible, and children today are extremely gullible and can be led in any number of directions religiously because their mind is not focused on truth. Philippians chapter 4. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4. John chapter 8 and verse 32. Be sober-minded. Think upon those things that are true. What does the Bible mean when it says sober-minded? It doesn't mean stay away from alcohol. That's a totally separate subject. Sober-minded means think logically. Think of things that are real, not things that people just make up. So if it's in the Bible, that's what you do in religion. If it's something else, then you don't know that that way is right. You don't know that that way is true. Well, but this was a great fella, and he told me blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and he's liable to be wrong. Well, Tim, you said umpteen years ago, blah, blah, blah. Who said it? You said it, Tim, and it was liable to be wrong, right? I was wrong because I didn't get it from the Bible. You go back if you want religion and you get it based on truth. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. John 17:17. There is only one basis from which we can be made free, and it's not from magical thinking or fabricated thinking. It's based on truth. You will help your children. You will help the others in your family immeasurably if you always encourage them. Keep a level head and ask yourself, is that really the way it is? Is it the truth? Whenever I meet anybody that's in or outside the church, out in public, let's say we're on vacation or something, and I go meet them. If I introduce myself to them, I have found members of the church before because they speak in a different way. They mention things like that, like about truth. And other people in different religious circles, they never talk like that. They're just not interested in what is real, the truth of it, getting to the bottom of things, and therefore they will talk in different terms to you. But whenever I hear somebody talk to me about things like truth and the Lord's way and stuff like that, then pretty soon I can just kind of ask them, say, if you don't mind me asking, where do you go to church? And they'll say, oh, I go to church at so-and-so Church of Christ. You know, and you're like, oh, there you go. Makes sense. I got it figured out now. You were interested in things that were of a theme. And that theme was according to what we ought to think about in Philippians chapter 4. So my encouragement to you tonight is if you have any ability at all to help those of a younger generation, bring them back to places like John 8, verse 32, John 17:17, Philippians chapter 4, 1 Timothy 2, verse 4. Tell them truth is important. Think on these things. Fulfill your responsibilities, and God will accept you, and you will have friends upon this earth as well. You will be successful. Life is not a big frustration. You can do this. The Lord expects you to do it. Now go out, my son, and do it. Give them that kind of encouragement. Give them that kind of instruction, and God will be pleased, and you'll have done a good job. If there's somebody here tonight and you haven't followed that way yourself, then the Lord says you can find the truth. And indeed, that truth will set you free. Free from what? Financial responsibility? No. Free from what? The responsibility to take care of your loved ones and all that? No. It's freedom from sin, from the bondage of knowing that you're guilty before God. And once you know the freedom that comes from Jesus Christ and the fact that he can release you from all the guilt of anything you've ever done, then my friends, you will not delay any longer. You'll come to Jesus to be released from that sin. If you'll come to him tonight, he will not reject you. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Won't you come unto him as we stand and sing?